Less than a decade had passed since Capcom defined the genre, but by 2005, surviving the horror had already gotten stale. And it seemed even the progenitorial Resident Evil series, with every subsequent sequel and spin-off, was decomposing as steadily as a rotting zombie. And then came Resident Evil 4, a game which redefined survival horror and stands in the eyes of many as one of modern gaming's finest achievements. It's important we illustrate the context in which this game released to retail, because as if the significance of its namesake weren't enough to create inherent hype, it was also following in the footsteps of one of the most critically acclaimed and innovative games of the last decade. Indeed, we see the indelible influence of Resident Evil 4 in many of this generation's biggest releases, perhaps none of which wear the badge more proudly than this one. This is Resident Evil 5, or as it perhaps should be known, Resident Evil 4.5.
What the hell just happened?
They didn't move like any zombies I've ever seen.
Make no mistake, if you've played Resident Evil 4, you should have a very good idea what to expect from Resident Evil 5, at least in terms of gameplay. Very little has been modified for this follow-up, as Resident Evil 5 sticks with essentially the same formula as its predecessor. Pseudo-zombies rush you from virtually every corner, and you spend the majority of your time running, turning, and unloading. Like in Resident Evil 4, you're still unable to shoot your weapon while moving, so the approach to enemy engagement hasn't changed. In some ways, that's a good thing. As silly as it may sound, the inability to shoot on the run is what makes Resident Evil feel distinct. Enemies approach with the same sinister walk as in Resident Evil 4, they sporadically make quick dashes at you, and whenever possible, they always seem to attack in groups. So the game essentially amounts to running to what you hope are safe spots, quickly turning around, and then using your high-powered arsenal to keep all sorts of monsters and creatures and pseudo-zombies at bay. It sounds formulaic, and I suppose it is, but it's also an absolute blast, pun intended. The process is simple, but the game does its best to ensure executing that process is a hectic and pulse-quickening affair. You're always on the move and searching for a safe place to shoot from, but ultimately you're chasing ghosts. For the most part, the level designs give the pseudo-zombies plenty of routes to find you, and while Resident Evil 5 is short on scares, being grabbed from behind by a zombie you didn't even know was coming always makes you jump. So it's a lot of fun to play, but in terms of control, the mechanic is really starting to show its age. Indeed, controlling your character often feels like you're driving a tank, and Resident Evil 5 feels a bit stiff and clunky as a result. Now, for years, Resident Evil fans have argued such controls are a deliberate design choice meant to amplify the terror. But if that argument were true, it would actually underscore their inadequacy in this particular case. Because, you see, Resident Evil simply isn't scary anymore. It really doesn't even try to be. The series' focus has completely shifted to action in Resident Evil 5, and the controls are simply incongruent with that focus shift. And that's another problem with Resident Evil 5, and one of the few areas in which it deviates from Resident Evil 4. Although this action-heavy mutation is rooted in what the franchise evolved into in Resident Evil 4, that game was still scary. It may have changed plenty of other things, but Resident Evil 4 was still a survival horror game at heart, a genuinely unsettling experience which showed a fantastic use of mood and atmosphere. But Resident Evil 5 is none of the above. It mimics Resident Evil 4 in gameplay only, stripping away all the presentation and design aspects which made it such an uneasy, and I would argue memorable, game to play. Resident Evil 5 is also a much shorter game than Resident Evil 4, and was clearly optimized to be played cooperatively with a friend. The plot ties the Resident Evil story together in a way sure to please longtime fans. So, on paper at least, Resident Evil 5 sounds like a fantastic game. But where Resident Evil 4 moved forward, this one regresses. Where that game innovated, Resident Evil 5 stands still. And if there's one thing you simply cannot do in the world of Resident Evil, it stands still.
Something's wrong with him! Watch out!
It's just us.
We're partners. To the end. Now let's get moving.
Copy that.